Wonderful. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Abrevaya Stein. I am a professor of history at UCLA, the Viterbi Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies, and also the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the Alan B. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm thrilled to welcome you today on behalf of the center to the Viterbi program in Mediterranean Jewish Studies inaugural event for our academic year, which highlights and celebrates the publication of Professor Clémence Boulouque's recent book entitled Another Modernity, Elia Benamozegh's Jewish Universalism, a wonderful book that is available from Stanford University Press and from any independent bookstore that you can locate near you or globally. I want to thank all of those joining us electronically, remotely, for staying socially distant with us, but also intellectually engaged. Now, today's event, I am joined by two wonderful colleagues and friends who I will introduce before we segue to our conversation. Our author for today is Professor Clémence Boulouque, who holds the Carl and Bernice Witten Associate Professor position in Jewish and Israel Studies, having received her PhD in Jewish Studies and History from NYU in 2014, and having served as a postdoc at the Katz Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She now holds her distinguished position at Columbia University. Her interests in general include Jewish thought and mysticism, interreligious encounters, intellectual history, and networks, with a focus on the modern Mediterranean and Sephardi worlds, as well as the intersection between religion and the arts and the study of the unconscious. She is a graduate of the Institute of Political Sciences in Paris, and she holds a bachelor's in art history and a postmaster's degree in comparative literature. And I want to mention that before Professor Boulouque became the professor and scholar that she is today, she began her writerly career as an author of novels in her native France, where she is both known as a novelist and an essayist. But her most recent work, published with Stanford Press, as I mentioned, is the one we are here to discuss and celebrate. I am also joined by Jessica Marglin, my colleague from just down the road, an associate professor of religion, law, and history, and the Ruth Ziegler Early Career Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California. Dr. Marglin earned her doctoral degree from Princeton, her bachelor's and MA from Harvard, and her research focuses on the history of Jews and Muslims in North Africa and the Mediterranean, with a particular emphasis on law. Now, we gather together to speak as a group about Professor Boulouque's book, and also more generally to speak about how the three of us, each in our own way, but also in dialogue, have embarked upon the exploration of transnational Jewish Mediterranean histories. But first we turn to Professor Boulouque, who will introduce us to her book, which will serve as the launching point for our conversation. Clémence, welcome and wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'd like to thank the Alan Levy Center for Jewish Studies and the Viterbi Center, and of course, you for organizing the event, and Jessica Marglin for agreeing to be part of the conversation. Your work and research has been such an inspiration for me through the years that I would not be able to be here talking about the book if it had not been for your generosity and your supports. And it's not a polite introduction, I really mean it. So why Benamozegh? Why read Benamozegh today? He's not a very well-known figure. He's a marginal figure even in the canon of Jewish studies. And I think that that's precisely the reason why there's a case to be made for expanding the canon through the study of Benamozegh and making sure that Sephardic voices in general, more broadly, get heard, which is also something that you're very committed to. And that's part of the polyphony of Judaism that Benamozegh was so passionate about. So Benamozegh had a degree of influence on a variety of actors, sometimes an unlikely collection, church reformers at the turn of the 20th century, Jewish intellectuals in the interwar period, and the painter Amedeo Modigliani, proponents of the Second Vatican Council, left-wing French Catholics, and then gets a little more complicated, the evangelical movement in the US and right-wing Zionists in Israel, as well as the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. So obviously that list shows that his reception, the reception of his work varied tremendously. And if Benamozegh's efforts aim to work toward dialogue and unity among religions, he can be seen as an instance of novel failure. But there is much we can learn from what seems to be a failure, and much to be learned about what he thought of modernity. Thus, the title of the book is Another Modernity, because regardless of his success or failure, Benamozegh did expand the criteria of religious modernity, which are usually identified by rationalism and universalism. So those are really, this is the broad claim of this book. I'll start out with some biographical details, because as I mentioned, I don't assume that some people in the audience will know him. Benamozegh is not a household name, although he was one of the most prominent rabbis in 19th century Italy. And beyond being a rabbi, he was also a prolific writer who authored historical studies, exegesis, a variety of newspaper contributions in Hebrew, Italian, and French. He also knew a little bit of Judeo-Arabic. He was an aspiring public intellectual who had a correspondence with a wide range of intellectual figures in France, in the Maghreb, and in the Middle East. He was born in the Tuscan port city of Livorno in 1823 to a family of Moroccan descent, and this really matters a lot. His hometown, which he never left, was the cradle. I mean, it's really a nexus in his work and his thinking. So for a little bit of background, since the 16th century, Livorno had been a free city that had enjoyed religious freedom, and as opposed to the rest of Italy, there was never a ghetto in Livorno. So one may argue that this openness toward other religions that Benamozegh advocated stems from this Livornese Jewish milieu, and that the port city shaped his understanding of what universalism means, which is not sameness, but that's unity in diversity. So that unity in diversity is a concept that's usually identified with Emmanuel Levinas and 20th century philosophy, but Benamozegh clearly established this idea and claimed that it was found in Jewish thought, and more precisely in Kabbalah. So I do think that it's important to reclaim this notion of universalism at a time of culture wars. And that's why the title of this talk is Mending Modernity. What are the tools that Benamozegh might give us? What is his legacy? So as an Italian Jew in the 19th century, Benamozegh really did witness cultural antagonism. He came of age during the Risorgimento, which is Italy's fight for independence. And he also experienced the turn taken by the Vatican, which came to represent reactionary forces in religion. And so that reaction Benamozegh saw as a danger to religion and to society more generally. Those forces simply weaponized tradition without understanding its true meaning, according to Benamozegh. What he meant by tradition was not something that needed to be disposed of because it was the opposite of modernity. But what he posited is that Jewish religion, Jewish tradition, and tradition in general has to be understood as a kind of polyphony, something that you find in the Talmud that enshrines the possibility and even the necessity of dissent. So you need to engage with the other in order to extract whatever truth can be found wherever it is to be found. And this is where a really important axis of thought enters, which is Kabbalah. So Kabbalah in Western Europe was broadly seen, especially after the Enlightenment, as a manner of superstition. It was the opposite of reason and maybe the remnant of an Oriental mind in Judaism. That is part of the discourse of Orientalism that Benamozegh loathed. As he championed the opposite. For him, Kabbalah was the secret mystical tradition that had been passed down from the time of Moses and Sinai to initiates, but instead of keeping it secret, it had to be turned into a political discourse. And why? Because of the hermeneutics of Kabbalah. one of the key aspects that I highlighted was the coincidence of opposites, whereby aspects of thoughts or any kind of worldview that seem mutually exclusive actually are shown to share common elements. And this is really in this friction that some elements or sparks of truth can be found and then need to be elevated. In addition, he claimed that Kabbalah constituted something akin to a myth-making force, and that myth is at the core of human appetite for the transcendent. So he also claimed that in those myths, you can find shared elements, the shared origin of humanity, for instance, in the figure of Adam, that he really made into a central figure of his thought, and that by highlighting the common origin of humanity, you could also reject whatever divisiveness could be found, especially at the time of the ascent of scientific racism. So he, in many ways, Kabbalah in Benamozegh's view resembled something that could be described, or that was later described, as a collective unconscious. And that's no coincidence, because Benamozegh was writing at the time of the emergence of the concept of the unconscious, something that brings together the rational and the irrational, and that Benamozegh claimed to be able to attenuate a dichotomy between those two concepts that seem to be polar opposites, that were actually responsible for the moral crisis of Western modernity, because it was a kind of zero-sum game. And the importance of Kabbalah was one of the examples of the contribution of the Oriental. So he reclaimed Orientalism, the discourse of Orientalism, and flipped it on its head, and claimed that basically the Orient had a lot to teach to Europe and the West, namely in overcoming the binaries such as religion and science or reason, and that was key to bridging the fault lines of modernity. So that stance seems pretty reasonable when one thinks of our world today. So that didn't mean smooth sailing, because in his view, again, the greater is the proximity, the greater is the potential for frictions. And there is also a quality of self-assertion of Judaism, which is a marker of Jewish modernity, that there is, Judaism has a lot to teach the world, and is unashamed to do so. So sometimes it was not very Christian reader friendly, and that raises the question of the intended audience, and maybe one of the key to his limited influence. That question of audience is a final aspect in the puzzle of Benamozegh's complex legacy. So in order to, as I mentioned, he aspired to become a public intellectual, or in the very beginning of what public intellectual meant, and so that's the reason why he switched to French, because he claimed that French had enabled him to gain a wider audience. He did this with the help of his Christian disciple Aimé Pallière, who was a former seminary student and who was grew disillusioned of the possibility of church reforms. And that disciple, who was also the editor of his book, was then accused by conservative Jews of Christianizing his mentor's thought, and specifically the magnum opus, Israel and Humanity, that was left unfinished at the time of Benamozegh's death in 1900. So Israel and Humanity was eventually published in 1914. And I got access to the manuscript that's part of the study in the book. And it is pretty obvious that it didn't Christianize the text, that Pallière didn't Christianize his mentor thought, but that he tried to simplify a French that you understand better if you know Italian. That's very convoluted. But the controversy is worth examining, because it really raises the question of who gets to have access to Jewish sources, who gets to be the proper interpreter of those sources. And the argument of the detractors is that there is no such thing as Jewish universalism, You have to have a universe of references as a Jew in order to be able to convey that message, that by definition, Pallier didn't check those boxes. And that is linked to the question of the superiority of Judaism. I mentioned the fact that there was a self-assertion in Benamozegh's work, but that doesn't necessarily mean hierarchy. Although the people who are trying to reclaim Benamozegh in a very ethnocentric way claim that that was the actual message, and that the sources that he marshaled were actually misunderstood by Pallier and other people who believed that he was an advocate of Jewish universalism. So that figure of Adam that I mentioned earlier would be a prime example. So Benamozegh takes it to be a symbol of the universal man. But in Loriani Kabbalah, which obviously Benamozegh knew, Adam is only Israel. So when Benamozegh discusses Adam, it actually means that he alludes to the superiority of Israel, and in the same vein advocates for an ethnocentrism that's actually a silent one, that's veiled. So a kind of esoteric, ethnocentric reading of him. So that solves the puzzle of his appeal for right-wing Zionists and more conservative Jews, because of this multi-layered aspect of his thought. So obviously, because of this wide spectrum, Benamozegh's hopes for religious unity have not materialized, not even the reception of his work, and his legacy really says it loud and clear. But I do think that the tools that he offered in pursuit of his goal, and namely turning Kabbalah into a political discourse, the notion of the coincidence of opposites, the reconciliation of science and religion, and the reinterpretation of tradition and modernity really offer new ways to think about his sign, and maybe about ours, and maybe even of mending modernity. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your comments. I wanted to lead us off with one question kind of comment, and then I'll certainly eagerly share the floor with Jessica as well. Clémence, you write in the introduction to this book about how Benamozegh stands at multiple crossroads, and I have the selection in front of you. You say that these crossroads help us map out intellectual networks in the Mediterranean and geographies of a Sephardic Enlightenment. I'm quoting, upend Orientalism by reclaiming the term Oriental as a badge of honor, understand his publishing endeavors as a cultural and political intervention on behalf of his co-religionists in the Maghreb and Middle East, reassess the meaning of Italian humanism and Christian Hebraism from a Jewish standpoint, resuscitate Kabbalah, both written and beyond Judaism, both within and beyond Judaism, and grasp its contribution to the nascent field of psychology of religion. Each of these threads, I continue to quote, constitutes a rich narrative, but the story to which the rabbi best contributes, it seems to me, pertains to the complexities of Jewish modernity. When I hear your introduction, and I focus on that part of the introduction to the book, and I think about how Benamozegh's influence was so far-reaching, contemporaneously and then in the future across so many cultural boundaries, I think part of the endeavor that you are embarking upon, if I can say so, is to kind of provincialize Ashkenaz when thinking about modernity. And I'm playing obviously on Dipesh Chakrabarty's notion of provincializing Europe. It seems to me partly what you are doing is saying that the mythical modernity that we associate with Jews, with Judaism, with a European Jewish encounter with the modern world, is a jaundiced picture if we don't factor in this complex Mediterranean world and a figure who has been provincialized, even though, in fact, when we think about the intellectual breadth and richness of his writing and its complex inheritance, the truth is precisely the opposite, that his story, his writing, his place, and the way you analyze it shows us, in a sense, how modest was the idea of Jewish modernity as it was actually advanced in the places that we associate with Jewish modernity, that is in the Ashkenazi realm. So I wonder if you could comment on that intervention and speak a little bit more about that phrase with which you ended the quotation I just read from the introduction about the complexities of Jewish modernity and how one rethinks those from the vantage of the Mediterranean.
Right. Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, this was clearly one of the interventions of the book, or at least something that I tried to do in this book. That's also why in my remarks I emphasized the importance of, the Oriental, like really weaponizing Orientalism against the Orientalists. And yes, there is this effort to displace modernity from on my part, so that it is not just a conversation among, like Berlin Jews. I mean, not that I have anything against that. I mean, this is an obviously very rich understanding of modernity, but I do think that the concept of, at least at the very least, the concept of multiple modernities is something that needs to be factored in and needs to have a more significant place in the conversation, in Jewish studies in general. This is, you can, in a way, you can almost claim that refusing to do so is a remnant of your Orientalism, still now in academia or in Jewish studies. Or discounting that intervention of Benamozegh because of the kind of provincialism of Kabbalah studies, or the notion that mysticism would be some sort of or ethnocentric or backwards understanding of Jewish philosophy, or that is it's inferior to Jewish philosophy. You do have this effort by Benamozegh to reclaim the key concepts of even Kant and show that, I mean, not telling that Kant is not the father of this concept, but saying that there is actually a way to read this that you can find in the Talmud. So the concept of practical reason, which is, the epitome of Kantian thought, can be teased out in the Talmud. And I do think that it enriches. I mean, it's not mutually exclusive that those multiple modernities, those different ways of understanding the dichotomies on which so much of the narrative of assimilation and modernity has been written is actually extremely important, and especially today. That possibility of an alternative, I mean, a different narrative, it's not alternative facts, because they're loaded, but really a different narrative or a rich or more layered narrative is something that I tried to pursue in this book, and that I think was at the heart of Benamozegh thought back in the days, which makes him even more modern, saying that there is multiple aspects. There is all those faces of truth, all those facets to truth, and that it's about time for those voices to be heard.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jessica, please.
Yeah, can I follow up? Because this is there's so much of your book, Clémence, that's dear to my heart. But this question of sort of using the Mediterranean, in this case, Benamozegh, to re-examine what we thought we knew about European history is, I think, so important. And it's sort of, I think, methodologically on the frontier of what Jewish studies scholars are starting to do with sort of what is, sometimes ghettoized as Sephardi and Mizrahi studies. I think rather than seeing, Sephardim and Mizrahim as kind of in their own multi-culti category, apart from the real Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, I think increasingly, first of all, obviously Sephardic history is being taken seriously, but then as you're doing in this book, you're sort of saying that actually from the Sephardic vantage point, we rethink what we thought we knew about Haskalah, what we thought we knew about modernity, what we thought we knew about Jewish intellectual history, Jewish thought. And I think that that's so great. But then I want to sort of take it a step further and talk a little bit more maybe about Livorno in particular, which is how I ended up getting interested in Benamozegh and how you and I connected about Benamozegh now many years ago. I don't know how that happened. Time really flies. But, Livorno is one of these sort of, uber Mediterranean cities in the sense that it was, it's so, the community itself, the Jewish community in particular, is so transnational and transregional, and it's so hyper connected to other parts of the Mediterranean. And then just more broadly, the city as a port, as a kind of place for the exchange of goods and ideas, and a kind of, as you say, this sort of unity through diversity. It has this really singular trajectory. So I guess my question then is, obviously, Benamozegh comes from this Moroccan family, right? And he's educated in part by his uncle, who is also Moroccan, and that's where he learns Judeo-Arabic and all of that. And yet he lives his entire life in Livorno, right? So how much does Benamozegh himself disrupt this binary between East and West that his sort of like anti-Orientalism or pro-Oriental stance it kind of assumes, and is he maybe making an argument for why the categories of East-West, or in the more updated version, Europe versus the Middle East, are in themselves insufficient, and really kind of calling us towards a Mediterranean perspective?
Right. Thank you so much, Jessica. So he barely uses the term Mediterranean, which is interesting because it also shows how the concept itself took on this almost methodological or turn in the 20th century. So he was ahead of his time in many ways, but that's not something that he even thought of. The terms that he used in order to, actually, you're right. I mean, he's claiming basically that this is almost a lame way of understanding the dynamics at work in thoughts, in intellectual exchanges, and in general, is that the Orient or the Western world need not to be so. The disjunction is actually almost lethal for the well-being of a society as a whole. And he really, as I mentioned, so Livorno is this kind of hub in which and again, it's not New York, like this idea of cosmopolitanism as we understand it today is not exactly the operating concept here, but it shows that there is those connections that need to happen in order for a society to work in a healthy way. And so he actually talks about the ghetto life in Eastern Europe and sees one of those the illnesses of Europe in the way in which those communities are unable to contribute to the to thought in general and to politics of those places. So and to that example, he opposes in the book of history, the history of the Essenes, he really shows that Judaism under Islam has flourished, and that the fact that, I mean, a ghetto for him is almost like a cardinal sin. You cannot ghettoize thoughts. There is no such thing. And if if that happens, then it's almost a self-inflicted wound of society. And so he really turns to those times where Jewish life thrived under the Muslim rule. And so that partly answers your question. He also looked at those dichotomies that were introduced by the Enlightenment, and he's not, to be clear, he's not a counter-Enlightenment figure in the sense of, Isaiah Berlin. He's very interested in the thought of Biko, which was then categorized as an anti-enlightenment figure, but that's because of the mythical power that he finds in Biko and in the ways in which societies are able to tell their stories through myth. But he's also someone who's eager to show and to really sort of internalize all the scientific discoveries of his time, and showing that the dichotomy between religion and reason is almost a poison, a toxic legacy of the Enlightenment, and that if religion is understood in the right way, it should almost be a sort of incentive, because then the unconscious is really a sort of a test for him, or it is evidence that the discovery of the unconscious, if the unconscious was anticipated in Kabbalah or in this in Kabbalistic materials, then that was already there. It just needed to be decoded in a way. Mm-hmm. So there is this notion of progressive revelation by which science will be vindicated by religion and vice versa. And so obviously that could not be further apart from what he was witnessing in his time, and the crisis that Christianity or Judaism were going through by sticking to those binaries. And that's something that he sees as being really the legacy of his Kabbalistic education and of the Orient as a place which is it's less geographic than spiritual. I mean, spiritual, or like a place, an intellectual. He talks about an intellectual Orient. So the idea is really a place in which those dichotomies would not poison actually the relations between the religions and further between citizens.
If I can follow your response, Clémence, and also Jessica's question with a sort of cognate question, but about space and mobility. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me that both of the two of you attend to Moroccan Jews of Moroccan origin or Moroccan Jews outside of Morocco, including in Livorno or in relationship to Italy. And I'm speaking now, Clémence, not only to your study, but Jessica, to your forthcoming book, Nationality on Trial, Legal Belonging Across the Modern Mediterranean. And within the writing on the Livornese Jewish community, so much energy has been spent on this notion of the Livornese in diaspora from Livorno and a commercial diaspora. But both of you are interested in something very different, which is the importation of Mediterranean Jewish culture to Livorno and the dynamic engagements that occur within that space, whether it's a physical space, Clémence, in your case, or Jessica, it's a little bit more of a legal conceptual space of what an emigre Moroccan Jew's legal status might be in relationship to Italy or Livorno. So I find this very interesting that you are both in a way muddling what we think we know about the importance of Livorno to the Mediterranean Jewish world and to the Mediterranean itself, such that it is a destination rather than a place to leave, a place to bring ideas and put them into a cauldron of complexity rather than a place to take commercial threads outward from. And I wondered if you would comment on that shared approach.
Jessica.
Well, sure. I'll just say that in addition to that, now I'm just piling on the questions. I think Clémence also is maybe worth reflecting on the ways in which Benamozegh has just been completely Italianized, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think is actually, so I think part of the answer to your question, Sarah, is an historiographical one, and also a question about memory and the construction of identity, because I don't think it's a coincidence that both Clémence and I are happening to work on these North African Jews who end up in Livorno, and then their stories get to a certain extent Italianized. And I think, or they themselves try to Italianize their stories. And I think part of that is just the continued Eurocentrism that pervades modern Western academic pursuits, but also just the ways in which Italian identity could be kind of, made more valuable. Now I'm thinking really starting only in the 19th and 20th centuries, right? And I think that for my story, so I'm working on this legal case of a North African Jew who ends up dying in Livorno, and then there's a big fight over his nationality.
Benamozegh actually wrote in defense of him.
This is how I got to my case, was actually through Benamozegh, because originally I was working on something else and I was interested in Benamozegh as a printer, and then I noticed that he'd written about the Shamama trial is what it's called, and that's how I got to it. So it's all thanks to Benamozegh. All good things come from Benamozegh. No, but I think that what I discovered, and this is more to your question, Sarah, is that in research around my case, is that there's this big community of Livornese Jews that end up mainly in Algeria and Tunisia, starting in the early 17th century, and sort of building steam through the 18th and into the 19th century. And I realized that there's this narrative that these Sephardic Jews came from Iberia, landed in Livorno, which was one of the only places in Christian Europe where Jews could land, starting with Livornine in the 16th century. And then from there, they kind of spread out to the rest of the Mediterranean. As you said, there's this, Livorno is always the sending place. But in actuality, there's this enormous back and forth that goes on, not just between Algeria and Tunisia, but Morocco, Egypt, the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Really, the whole Mediterranean is involved in this constant back and forth, with Livorno as a hub, but it's not unidirectional. And that unidirectionality, I think, is something that really gets projected back onto the story starting in the 19th century. I'm going to make the case, there's a lot to say about this, but I'm going to make the case that it did have a lot to do with legal status, because extraterritoriality, the privileges that you got by virtue of being a European subject in the Islamic Mediterranean were such that anybody who could try to claim Italian ancestry, Livornese ancestry, would do so. So there was a way in which the legal status of extraterritoriality encouraged these Jews to portray themselves as having come from Livorno elsewhere, so that then they could sort of latch on to that. But I think that, the truth is that the construction of Italianità or Livornità, I don't know what the equivalent is, it's something that really happens, I think, much, much later, and that gets projected onto the past. And then I think we've kind of succumbed I think the historical profession and Jewish historians generally have kind of succumbed to that narrative to say, oh, look at these Italian Jews. Sarah, this shows up so much in Salonika. Like, there are all these Italian Jews. It's totally unclear when, if at all, they actually came from Italy, or whether they're kind of constructing this Italian connection ex post facto. And it has a lot to do with extraterritoriality again. So that's kind of my, I don't know. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. If you're thinking of a place from which you leave, as opposed to a place from where you go, that diminishes also the influence of Morocco, and that makes it a central place. This is a place from which this Italianità or European identity can radiate, right? And so, as opposed to what basically Benamozegh was talking about, which is the Moroccan legacy is not just is an intellectual one, right? So that enriches the narrative of Italy and Italian Jewish history by adding those elements, instead of exporting them, importing them, creates a completely different story and a much more layered identity. And to your point, coming from France, all the Tunisian Jews that I knew or that I know, the proud ones. People were talking about being Livornese and not Grana, right? So the idea of, but my family is from Livorno, was also this kind of internalized Eurocentric or Eurocentrism that you found among people who obviously were absolutely not of Livornese descent, and somehow got these passports, and we know that the passport business was sometimes a shady one, and so that's extremely important. And Benamozegh's life and his family story also shows how the uncle. So he lost his father when he was a toddler, and so the uncle was actually a Kabbalist, and a rabbi who was in Gibraltar. Which is also a sort of blind spot. Gibraltar, Morocco, and he really went back and forth. And this multi-directionality is also very important. So the fact that Benamozegh never left Livorno is almost an anomaly in his family history. But again, like if you have this kind of unidirectional narrative of Livorno bringing its light to the Mediterranean Jews, I mean, it's almost, and again, like there is merit to the narrative of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, but there's almost this kind of enlightenment that can only come from Europe or from a Eurocentric narrative that lasted for so long that it really takes a little bit of deconstruction or reclaiming a different kind of narrative.
Well, it is, Jessica, you mentioned earlier the case of Salonika, and it also struck me as very evocative of what you are describing to Livorno and to these categories of law and identity and culture and language and heritage that here, Salonika too, you have a place with so many inward and outward paths and so many diverse histories, such that the category of Sephardic Jew itself is internally so much more variegated than we have come to assume. So there's a kind of sanitization of Mediterranean, of Jewish, of Sephardic, of Livornese through the scholarship, which in fact doesn't represent realities of the time at all. The other sanitization I see, Clémence, in your work is that it seems that over time, Benamozegh was stripped from his intellectual context until the writing of your book. And I was struck by how deeply immersed he was in an intellectual conversation that transcended boundaries. And yet over time, he comes to be I forget the word you use, but a forgotten subject or an unlikely subject. I forget precisely the language you use in your introduction, but he wasn't unlikely at all, in fact, and he wasn't forgotten. He was visible, he was active, he was engaged in a transcontinental and indeed sort of cross-regional interplay of ideas. So it's so striking that what you referred to before is as a form of provincialism gets pasted on him when in fact his engagement is anything but.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. That's exactly the case. I mean, he is someone who actually could have checked so many boxes that nobody knew where to put him. And so usually when you encounter Benamozegh, it's about the revival of the Noahide laws or the dichotomy between philosophy and Kabbalah. I mean, Alessandro Guetta's work is wonderful in trying to see how he reconciled those dichotomies in his work. But his origins and his identity as that he claimed, sometimes I must say also in writings that were not mainstream or that were not intended for a wider audience, but he really talked about his African roots. He uses the word Africa, and showed how that mattered. But when he turned himself, and so maybe that's also part of the problem, when he turned himself into this aspiring French intellectual, he also borrowed the codes of French, of the expectations of French intellectuals, and especially actually the Alliance Israélite Universelle. When he was one of his first, one of the first books that he wrote in French was called Jewish and Christian Ethics, and he had this kind of pugnacious tone, which he claimed was part of a healthy debate. But then the Alliance, the committee that awarded the prize, that was an entry for a prize, and he submitted this manuscript, and they would not give him the first prize because they felt that would maybe upset their Catholic brethren. So that question of tone is also one of the reasons why Benamozegh was discounted also in Italy, where some of his contemporaries and even his renegade students called him a paladin of Kabbalism, and used very almost derogatory language to discount him as a thinker. So not only is that, how you try to re-envision a scholarship that makes a broader place for the Mediterranean and try to disrupt this narrative or displace modernity. But you also have to do the work of contextualizing his reception in light of what the expectations were and how some of his Jewish contemporaries were trying to blend in. And so Benamozegh, because he had this, this kind of self-assertive tone, and being, not ashamed to be this Oriental, that again, using the Oriental as a badge of honor, made people or some of his contemporaries uneasy, and that's also why his voice tended to be silenced. So it's a two-tiered problem of what were the efforts made to create this narrative of assimilation when someone had this kind of bombastic version of the Jewish contribution to civilization.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I mean, it is actually interesting, and in some ways now I'm just going to say the opposite of what I said earlier, which about Benamozegh as this sort of uber Mediterranean figure, because on the one hand, biographically, certainly he crosses this region, and in his publishing, he's very, as you say, he has this kind of really active engagement with the non-Ashkenazi world, and he's doing a ton of work publishing the writings of rabbis from North Africa and parts of the Middle East. On the other hand, the few intellectual exchanges that he has with Mizrahi Jews, I mean, with the Syrian Jews that get super angry at him, and then later, in the case of the Shemama case that I work on, there are these Tunisian rabbis who call him an apikoros, heretic, essentially. It's a little bit more technical than that, but it doesn't go super well. He doesn't kill with the Mizrahi Jews, and I think as you say, I mean, certainly I think you say this at some point in the book, and I forget exactly where, but you say that actually it's sort of striking, given his networks, given his background, he has very little to say about Islam. In all of this emphasis on interreligious dialogue, it's all about Christianity, and in that sense, it is this very Italian context, and as you say, his intellectual interlocutors are clearly largely Europeans and Christians. Not only, but so how does one square that?
It's hard to. I mean, that was something that really bothered me. So I don't think that everything can be squared or has to be squared, but I do think that so two things. First, yes, things didn't go so well with especially the rabbinate in Aleppo that put his book on. His commentary of the Pentateuch was ban and burn, which is basically the punishment. And so it's cherem. It's a declaration of heresy. So, and they knew well that he was a self-proclaimed and proudly so Orthodox rabbi. So there is a contradiction here, right here. But actually, it makes complete sense. He if he understood the coincidence of opposites, right? The idea that truth can be extracted wherever you find it. There is no surprise in this, what will have been extremely outrageous for those Aleppo rabbis, where it compares the Bible with Greek mythology, where he uses Spinoza in his biblical commentary. And so they accused him of westernizing, of trying to sort of infiltrate the Orient with Western ideas, whereas whereas he was actually trying to deconstruct the West through the Orient, or through this understanding of the Orient as a place in which this Kabbalistic concept of coincidence of opposites actually would not apply. So 1865 is when his book was banned and burned, and this is when he shifted gears and almost completely stopped writing in Hebrew, as if he thought that his message was not, he was not the best messenger for what he had to say. He turned to a French or French-speaking, Italian-speaking audience, and what he did was actually publish, and this is where his printing activity is so fascinating, published and printed other books of people who viewed, who shared these views on Jewish tradition and the need to make tradition, to reconcile tradition and modernity. So it's almost as if there was a sort of decoupling of his work and his thinking, and so he left that part of that part of the Orient to others, but he invested their work with his own ideas. So that makes it even more fascinating, because it makes you reconsider or think further about what publishing actually achieves. And so I think it was very strategic about how to best convey his message. I mean, not strategic enough that you would use, not inflammatory words sometimes to describe Christianity when he talked about in French, and when he described Jesus as pretty much a failed Kabbalist, and the apostles of people who are not able to understand that it was Kabbalistic symbols, and that they came up with this new religion, which is actually just, Judaism redux. But that's also a different question. The idea of speaking truth to others also sometimes means to create those frictions, and it's probably one of the limitations of his thoughts, that truth should know no boundaries, and sometimes ignoring who his interlocutors actually were.
But I wondered if this was indeed an element to the fecundity of his writing, that it would continue to be reimagined by so many varied figures and schools in the decades to come. Was it the very piquant tone that irked the rabbis in Aleppo? Was it that he chose not to write about Islam and chose to write so intently about Christianity and Judaism? Was it the breadth of his interests? Or is it possible that there was strategy at play?
I think it's all of this to various degrees. The big question of why he wrote so, his writings about Islam are so scarce, is I think that he probably didn't see Islam as a problem. If the crux, the real dissension is with Christianity. In most of his work, the description of life under the Islamic rule is that of a coexistence and almost like a mutual understanding. So that can be part of the Italian Renaissance tradition, as Jessica said, and in which he completely inscribes himself. Pico della Mirandola, all those, he knew his Italian, first of all, he was an avid reader and a polymath. So there is nothing that he probably didn't read if he could get a chance. but which makes the research also even more interesting, because you have to sort of, try to retrace the steps, and there were multiple steps. But the idea that the real problem of modernity is induced by the secularism of a Christian universe of references. And that's something that he saw at play, again in Italy, where the Pope, when it was initially thought to be a reformist and turned out to be the Pope who wrote the Syllabus of Errors, really condemning modernity. And so I think that the engagement that he saw as being the most urgent and the most important was Christianity. So Paul Fenton at the Sorbonne had this. He had a piece about his limited engagement with Islam, which was the appendix to his work called Jewish and Christian Ethics. And so, with an appendix on Islam, on Islam, and he said that he's basically, compared to other Orientalists of his time, he had a more expensive understanding of Islam, and the philological work that he did was exactly not that of an Orientalist, but that was very limited in scope. And that's something that I honestly wish he'd worked more on, because I think that it would have been absolutely fascinating. But it seems to have been outside of what he judged to be the urgency of his day.
Clémence, maybe just as a final question, this is one of those things that one usually asks at the beginning, but I think it's maybe worth getting in here, because I've heard of versions of this, and I think it's so fascinating. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what brought you to Benamozegh, and a little bit more about how you went about doing the research? Because I know also, especially for an intellectual historian, you were so often in the archives and so deeply immersed in the Livornese world.
Well, thanks. You've heard versions of this, but so as Sarah mentioned in the introduction, I come from a very French background where religion is almost anathema. I mean, you can't really. This kind of secular background makes it so that in my time as a journalist, whenever people would utter the word religion, it was usually followed by eye rolling or something, to the extent of murderers. And so I was interested in really looking at religious figures that try to work as maybe a hyphens. So people who try to build bridges between religions. And so that's how I came across Benamozegh. It's a beautiful, it's an interesting story. I was here on 9/11. I was in New York on 9/11, and I started, I was devastated. And the idea that this essentialization of religious violence would become so widespread and become so weaponized in political discourse was, crushing me. So that's how I started looking into those things. And I was doing a Master of International Studies at Columbia, and I had a Hebruta. And so we looked up Benamozegh and Aimé Pallier, and that's how it all started. Then I had to go back to France, where I worked as a journalist for a few years. And I came back to the US because I had gotten the bug of religious studies and Jewish studies. And this is where I rekindled this love for, interreligious dialogue, or trying to really look into ways in which there can be a different, another discourse, another narrative. And so that's how I came across Benamozegh. And then I found the figure so fascinating. And also I was a little frustrated by the way in which his background was ignored, and really trying to see how those networks and this intellectual history was so much richer than the story of someone who switched to French and wrote this book. And so, the idea that his Moroccan background was also something that attracted me a great deal, and trying to see how we can, so the other narrative of interfaith encounter or interreligious encounters, plus displacing the narrative of modernity, was something that I thought was very irresistible, I guess. So that's the start.
Well, Clémence, our hour is alas nearly at an end, and I want to say that we are so glad you got the bug, and that the bug led you after many years, and I know after extensive research and writing, led you to write such a beautiful and important and artfully written book that we are so grateful to read and engage with. Under normal circumstances, we would have the pleasure of gathering over a raised glass and a meal to celebrate your achievement. But I'm glad at least we have this opportunity to do it online. And congratulations on the book. We hope to welcome you back to UCLA soon. Jessica, warmest thanks for being in conversation with us.
That's a privilege.
We hope to invite you both to UCLA's Levy Center as soon as possible. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.